I would like to welcome everyone to today's discussion, reflecting Georgia's pivotal elections. What's next? On Saturday, 26th of October, Georgia voted in parliamentary elections that were dubbed as a referendum by both opposition and the government, the ruling party, Georgian Dream. The results were unexpected, at least to one of the sides. The Georgian Dream won by 54% of the votes and is expected to be forming another government to stay another 4 years in power. Just few days after the elections, we had this opportunity to join with both Georgian experts and international experts who have been observing Georgia and analyzing Georgian political developments for many years, to reflect on the election results, what we might expect as scenarios for the future, for the impact on the region, and also next possible steps for reactions of the international community here. We have a truly great panel today. Bidzina Lebanidze, a colleague from the Georgian Institute of Politics, senior analyst, Nona Mikhelidze, senior fellow at Istituto Affari Internazionali, Stefan Meister, the head of the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia at DGP, and Professor Julie George, associate professor at Queen's College, focusing on ethnic politics, democratization, and state building. Without much further ado, let me please jump right in. I encourage our participants, our listeners, to write your questions in the Q&A. We will try to make sure to leave time and space for discussion and for exchange. We have 1 hour for this discussion and look forward for interesting analysis and debate. Let us start with Bidzina Lebanidze. Could you please tell us more about your assessment of the election results and possible scenarios that could unfold? We see certain resistance from the opposition politicians despite quite strong position of the ruling party.
Yeah, thanks very much, Renata. Well, clearly those elections were very crucial for Georgia, also seen as a significant test for its democracy, also in the context of Georgia's EU accession. And now it seems that we are moving towards another political crisis. So, I mean, a lot has been discussed regarding the irregularities during the elections, right? Putting in a more general context, irregularities is not a new thing in the history of Georgian elections. It was present during every election, but the key question here is, to what extent did those irregularities impact the overall outcome of election? And this is the core issue now, and this question mark needs to be removed to prevent a major political crisis and also more distancing from the West. But putting in a more broader context, it's also essential to note that current post-election crisis differs substantially from any other political crisis that took place in Georgia over the last 20 years. And therefore, it's also very hard to predict what will be the outcome of this particular crisis. Just as an example, if we compare it to the Rose Revolution, Georgia today is no longer a failed state, and the state machinery is far more robust and monolithic nowadays. And society is also more polarized, with GD having its own social base and its own electorate, so it can be also mobilized. But on the other hand, unlike the post-election crisis, for instance, from 2008, when the West basically legitimized then government's second term, this time the West appears to be unwilling to endorse the incumbent government's questionable democratic practices and to legitimize also the questionable election outcome. And therefore, this is another key difference, that the current government lacks the Western legitimacy based on these elections, which it desperately needs. So again, this is different from any other political crisis. And in this situation also, it's probably crucial to predict what actually Georgian Dream's ultimate political objectives are, or what is the political endgame in their perceptions. And I see here two potential pathways. So the one is that if the government is actually ready to fully isolate itself from the West and will align and fully align with a broader illiberal camp, not only Russia, but there's also China, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Belarus, etc., etc. So those are many. And then in this case, of course, the opposition and civil society will find their options more limited. However, here the key question is, to what extent can GD in fact afford a complete U-turn away from the West? Because such a move on the one hand would lead to prolonged political instability in the country, but on the other hand also to significant and swift economic decline, and the government knows that. And the second scenario would be, and if we consider the GD as a more or less rational actor, then its aim probably would be to pursue some kind of Orbanesque equilibrium, balancing to some extent between the West and Russia. And this scenario, in combination of external and internal pressures, could probably prompt the government to some kind of negotiated solution. And while it may not lead to immediate power transfer to opposition, it could, for instance, at least lead to a more balanced and democratic parliament. And the GD could be also compelled, for instance, to offer further concessions, and one of them could be, and let's address the elephant in the room, which is the revising the foreign agents law, which probably the ruling party no longer would need in its current form after theoretically consolidating the political power, and could use it as a bargaining chip with the West. And probably one of the objectives of adopting it was exactly this, to have one more bargaining chip with the West. Now about the West itself, and I'll finish with my short intervention. How can the West help to resolve the crisis? So in my opinion, a major contribution could be to initiate some kind of joint US-EU election fact-finding commission to investigate the irregularities, or at least to assist the Georgian government to investigate those irregularities. And this would be probably the most impactful intervention. Because when the EU simply says that investigate those irregularities, it really doesn't mean anything. It's an empty signifier, because political factions in Georgia don't really trust each other. And if state authorities only on their own were to investigate, probably the opposition and its supporters would not accept those findings. And then kind of international body could thus offer a more viable, more feasible solution here. And if it's done, it should be done, of course, swiftly, and don't take too much time. And also one more point, ideally, this kind of commission, if built, should be probably led by the European Union, because EU, even compared to the United States, is a key actor in Georgia. Even if many Europeans would not believe this, because also in the context of Georgia's accession and Georgia being EU candidate, I think EU plays a more crucial role here. And the European Commission, for instance, is also about to issue the progress report on Georgia and the enlargement progress report, which matters a lot for Georgia. And they could lead the process. And then depending on the commission's findings, then on the one hand, if they say that irregularities were insignificant in terms of overall outcome, we need to accept the election results and go into parliament. But if they say that those irregularities affected the election outcome, then Commission could, I don't know, propose, for instance, the snap elections. It's, of course, the other thing, if the government agrees to that, or at least to push the government to revise the vote count and adjust the reported figures that could result in a more balanced and democratic parliament. And besides that, of course, the US and the EU could of course continue also with their sticks and carrot policies, but they really do need bold initiatives, and initiating this kind of commission would be an important step if they want to play important and positive role in solving Georgia's political crisis. So I think my 7 minutes are now over. I will stop here to stay within my time limits, and I'm happy to further expand on those points if there are questions. Thanks.
Thank you. There is one question in the Q&A about the role of long-term observers who have been present in Georgia for the last 3.5 months, whether making them heard and leaning more into their assessment could be another avenue for further investigation. And another question I have: what do you think could be the options for opposition or those who are discontent with the election results for the further avenue for action? It seems like the opposition is looking for ways how to connect with the West. What could be done also on the ground? What is needed?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Yeah, regarding long-term international observers, yes, absolutely. If some kind of international fact-finding body is created, they could be definitely part of it as experts or as participant side, and they could contribute a lot to investigation about the democratic quality of elections. Yeah. Now, regarding the opposition tactics, again, it's very difficult to predict the outcome of the current political crisis. So on the one hand, they need a long-term comprehensive strategy also to keep their electorate and also generally the protest population mobilized for probably extended period of time even. On the other hand, also to remain constructive if there is need for this kind of constructive approach, but at the same time also to keep linkages with the international community and with the West, and to leverage the international presence and international pressure coming to Georgia to achieve their results.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Nona now and talk more about the role of the EU. As Georgia has declared the intention to join the European Union, and conducting free, fair elections was one of the 9 recommendations on which the report has come out already maybe today. What was the actual role? What was the impact of the EU throughout the process?
Good evening, Renata. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to talk about the EU's role, not only throughout this process, but also throughout last 10 years in Georgia, in a sense that, and start this with a kind of bold conclusion, which I will later support with the examples, but let me say this straight ahead, that it is a total collapse of the EU's policy towards Georgia. If the Georgian dream reached this level of authoritarianism, where not even free and fair election is guaranteed anymore, it is also the result of the EU Commission approach of accommodation of culture of governance of the GD. It is a result of EU Commission, DG NEA desk working on Georgia, not taking into account the warnings of number of EU parliamentarians who over the years were warning the Commission about the deterioration and backsliding of democracy in Georgia. It is a result of the reluctance of the EU ambassador and EU delegation in Georgia, not supporting openly the civil society representatives when they were victims of different kind of harassment. It is, and if we go back, it is the result also of so-called Charles Michel diplomacy, which instead of reinforcing parliamentarianism in Georgia and the role of parliament more broadly, it only contributed to discrediting the opposition parties. Now, the Georgian Dream's decision to reintroduce the foreign agents law has reflected not only a shift in foreign policy orientation, but also a regression in democratic development. And the root of this current crisis extends beyond governmental decisions to this and goes to the critical misstep by the EU. Also some of the Georgian opposition parties and civil society organizations, because I think that the prioritization of geopolitics over democracy has not only jeopardized Georgia's path towards EU integration, but it has also hindered progress on crucial democratic reforms. I think that back in December 2023, despite falling short of the EU's conditions for candidate status, Georgia was granted the designation, which bolstered the ruling party and marginalized the efforts for meaningful democratic reform. It was a huge failure from the EU side, and I think that the civil society, motivated by a candidate status at any cost mindset, collaborated with the government to maintain the appearance of compliance with the EU conditions, and some sidelined dissenting voices and skewed narratives that prioritizing public support for European integration over the imperative of genuine democratic progress. And some of us, maybe people connected today, remember how our colleague Nona Mikhelidze, for example, was treated because he dared to say that, you know what, we have to deserve this status because of our democratic progress, not because there are geopolitical issues into the play. And I well remember how he has been treated by his colleague during the period. So granting the EU's candidate status to Georgia has backfired, and has backfired in these days, I think. Rather than stimulating reform, the EU's failure to enforce conditionality effectively emboldened the Georgian government to pursue repressive policies, viewing candidate status as a validation. The party then decided to reintroduce foreign grants law and to reintroduce and vote an anti-LGBTQ legislation. What we saw after was this US uprising that followed last spring, and the EU somehow signaling also the EU to reassess the drivers of transformation in the country and overhaul its strategy for engaging with civil society organizations. Also because if we look what kind of civil society organizations the EU was engaging, and this was organizations which are included in this so-called Eastern Partnership, civil society Eastern Partnership platform, organizations that have no connection with the grassroots movements, that organizations widely unknown for the Georgian population, that have no legitimacy, and those organizations who signed the memorandum of cooperation with GD in order to make this facade of democracy and to be in compliance in one of the conditions posed by the EU, which required the government to be engaged with civil society in the process of transition towards democracy. So I think that the US uprising of spring signaled also to the EU somehow to revise who is the real actor of change in Georgia, and to revise its policy towards civil society as well. Today, I think the EU is in front of the critical juncture because we are expecting another enlargement package, publication of another enlargement package, and the EU's decision whether to open an accession negotiation to Georgia. And I think that security and stability demand unwavering commitment to reinforcing democratic principles through rigorous conditionality, and anything jeopardize not only Georgia's future, but the EU's fundamental identity of being kind of the normative power. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, indeed, over the last couple of years, it seemed that democracy, rule of law has been at the forefront of EU's debate, especially on the enlargement. But it doesn't seem to have won results in terms of Georgia. What do you think should change now in the EU's approach to countries like Georgia, and also to prevent something similar happening in other countries like Moldova, which are also very vulnerable? Nona, if you could answer.
You are asking me about the EU, because I heard the US, so I thought you
EU. Sorry.
No, I think that Bidzina was saying before, you now has to decide what to do with this election, because we saw now the statement of the Young Lawyers Association, which ask the government to cancel the results of the 2000-something electoral stations, which would mean a new election. So the EU has to take the position on this, and it is not even a perfect timing, because we see that the changes in the commission, I mean, the new one has to start to work in 2 weeks time frame, and we have upcoming US election next week. So in terms of the reaction or from having a reaction from the international community, it's not perfect timing for opposition or civil society to get some support from them. But thinking more generally in terms of democracy support, I think that what the EU has to do is somehow to reflect on the important turning points in Georgia's democracy development, and use this turning point as a moment of reflection, and somehow in order to decide then how to reassess its policy towards Georgia. I would imply the harsh conditionality in any case. That's why since the beginning I was against granting the status to Georgia, and that's why I said that it only bolstered the bad governance of the GD. So this should be definitely revised, also because, I mean, thinking from the EU's perspective, we are all fed up here by Orban, so we don't need kind of the Orbanization of the EU. And what we are observing in Georgia, this is a quite Orbanization of the system. So there are some short-term challenges which regards recognition of the elections and how to act in this moment. I see that some of the EU members have more adequate approach and assessment of the issues, like the Baltic states or Nordic countries, as usually happens towards Eastern Europe, and others are more cautious in order to come up with the clear messaging. And then there is, of course, this long-term challenge, how define the EU democracy support more generally in the candidate countries, that should go beyond the mindset of the EU democratic support in the neighborhood, because these countries are not only neighborhoods, they are candidate countries.
Thank you. That will also be linked with how you will redefine the Eastern Partnership in the future. But talking about vulnerabilities, Stefan, could you perhaps comment on the role of Russia in Georgia's political developments? There was a lot of discussion about the possible role of Russia in the elections, but also pre-election environment, and also on the impact of the international environment, the ripple effects that these elections might have in the region.
Thank you again. Thank you also for the invitation and setting up this event. I think it's really important to reflect and to discuss also with the events which will still come in the next weeks and further also strategize on the whole issue. before I start, just one or two short comments. I think what I saw from my perspective was the most managed and best prepared elections in terms of falsifying an election, manipulating an election, which we have ever seen, in my opinion, in newer Georgian history. And I would say not only the EU was not maybe not well prepared for this, but also Georgian opposition and organized civil society was not prepared for this scale of manipulation on all levels. And what we see also in interaction with Russia, playing here definitely a role, but also with Viktor Orban, who not just by accident traveled closely after the election to Tbilisi. I think this is all this all has a playbook. Yeah, this is not just happening by accident. So I think we see really GD and Bidzina Lebanidze having a plan also, which is quite comprehensive from my perspective. That's the first point. The second point, I think I'm not so sure if GD really still think that they need the legitimization of the West, as Bidzina was saying this. I think they're creating exactly alternative legitimizations for this election, and Viktor Orban played here a role. Russia is playing a role with a very early reaction, both on the result. We have the recognition also by Turkish President Erdogan, I think, which is very important for the regions and both neighboring countries. So I don't know how much the EU and the US are still playing for them such a big role. I think that's something also to discuss, but they're looking for alternative legitimization, alternative concepts. And this is Hungary in a way for me, and it's also Russia in a way. So I just wanted to, because I think for me these are really important points. I think we have to understand from a Russian perspective, with this large-scale war since 2022, the South Caucasus and Georgia are even more important now for Russia than before. Because Russia needs the South Caucasus from a geopolitical, geostrategic, geoeconomic point of view as a transit region to Iran, to India. It needs alternative routes to circumvent sanctions, and Georgia is here key for Russia. And also, if it wants to disrupt, for instance, the east-west corridor, the so-called middle corridor, I think Georgia is crucial for Russia. So I think for Russia, interfering into this election and also interacting with the Georgian government is maybe even more relevant seen than it was seen from the EU side in a way, where I think there is a kind of an understanding that Georgia is a key country, also because of its past reforms. But in my opinion, was not on the priority list high enough to be more active here and to be more strategic, which is anyway not a strength of the EU. So I think what we see is Russia wants to weaken the West globally and regionally, and it wants to solve regional problems with regional actors without the EU and the US. And I think what we see in the South Caucasus now, also with the 3+3 format, for instance, with Iran, Turkey, and Russia. And also this offer to the Georgian government to become the headquarter of such a format, I think is exactly promoting this approach also in the South Caucasus. And I think this is for me another element of Russia's policy towards the region. I think we see a massive impact, definitely, of Russia on this parliamentary election in terms of disinformation. With all the narratives, we have seen also interaction between Georgian Dream representatives and Russian officials with very similar narratives or interaction to each other. I think what we also have some proofs that say like this, that there are Russian advisors also for GD, and we know that the Russian intelligence service is active in Georgia itself. There are some reports about this. I think, but Russia is even more important, or maybe not more, but is also beyond this important as a norm setter. foreign agent law, LGBT law, also the media law, which is discussed. I think these are all elements of Russian norm setting. These are copies from the Russian legislation. So Russia is here a successful norm setter also in a competition with the EU, and GD was exactly implementing this. And if we're looking also into this whole war discourse, sovereignty discourse, I think it's all inspired by the Russian side. And I think for Georgian Dream, which already moved, in my opinion, Georgia into an authoritarian state. So we have practices of authoritarian governance already in Georgia since some time, and also within the framework of this election campaign. Russia is a model, and Hungary is a model also for the G government. But I would be very careful to say that all this is operated by Russia. And I think for me, it is problematic that the opposition was focusing on this either Russia or the EU, which I think didn't work as well with the society than they expected. I think much more this fear approach, war or peace, was working with this society, and I would be very careful to say this is purely a Russian textbook. I think it was for Bidzina Lebanidze about his personal survival. Staying in power is for him personally very crucial. He has been socialized in Russia in the 1990s. He has made his money there. So he is very much influenced by the Russian political culture, especially this mafia culture of the 1990s in Russia. But I think still he put his money also into this campaign, and he was the main operator, in my opinion, of this election campaign. I think what is a big challenge for me is this vulnerability of the country. It's not only about Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Russian troops in these territories, which is a constant threat to Russia. And even with this, it was played in the election campaign. GD has no policy for these disputed regions, but it was playing with this fear. And I think also socioeconomically, this is a very vulnerable society, which is also there are a lot of people you can bribe. I think we saw similar things in Moldova also. So I think this socioeconomic environment makes it also easier for Russia to manipulate, but sure also for the government. And maybe just on the, not to talk too long on the international or on the regional international environment, if you ask me for this, I think what we see now in the South Caucasus is, from my perspective, an end of the Russian hegemony. Russia is not anymore the decisive security actor in the South Caucasus. We see, especially with the Second Karabakh War and then with the Russian 2022 invasion in Ukraine, we see that Turkey and Azerbaijan are the key actors in the region. So we see really a big shift in the regional balance of power and in the regional security order. That means the countries are even more vulnerable in a way, and we are in a transition to a much more transactional South Caucasus, with different actors also impacting on the regional security order. And the question for me is what role the EU will play here, which is not really a security actor. What does it really mean for its connectivity and Eastern Partnership or neighborhood policy? How much the enlargement policy will play into it? So we still don't know how the EU redefines its role, despite being more active. But I think my main challenge I see with the EU is it tries to solve new problems and a new reality with the old instruments in a way. But we are already in a very different reality, not only in this region, and it has no adequate instruments in the way to react to these security challenges we have in this region.
Thank you very much. Indeed, we not only do not have new instruments, but also a lot of governments around the world, in the West especially, have been busy this year with their own pre-election campaigns. And the Georgian Dream certainly factored this in as well. The US elections are coming up next week. A lot of anticipation in this part of the world as well. Julie, what might we expect after the US presidential elections for this region? Can there be a shift in attention, in approach to countries like Georgia?
Hi, yeah, thank you for the invitation and for the really interesting discussion. I've really enjoyed listening to my co-panelists, and I have to preface this by saying that I'm actually an expert in Georgian politics, not in American politics, and I'm a domestic person, not a foreign policy person. But with that caveat, I think when I was putting together my thoughts on your question, Renata, I think the best way to think of this is in terms of short, medium, and long-term American responses. And in the short term, I mean, I think that with gentleness, I want to kind of disagree with the premise of the question. I don't think the Georgian Dream manipulated this election to take advantage of American distraction. Georgian elections are typically in the fall, and so like there was always going to be an election in the fall. I think if they really wanted to do it, they would have done it next weekend, not last weekend, because actually there is time for an American response. And so, I mean, the other thing about the American elections, of course, is we have our inaugurations happen in January. So even if Trump wins the election, I don't think that, I mean, especially now, if Trump wins the election in November, and typically there's been a norm in American politics that the outgoing administration kind of stop taking action that might undermine the incoming administration. And I think at this particular moment in time, just given where the norms are in American politics, that Biden is going to go full steam ahead. I don't think if Trump wins, he's like, oh, wait, we've got to, modulate our foreign policy. No, he's not going to do that. He's going to go forward. But you can already see the American response, the original American response to the elections was, Georgians had a choice. These were marred with falsification or marred with problems. And then 2 days later, there was a much stronger American statement. So I think the Americans in the short term are waiting for data. They're waiting for information about the falsification and the extent to which it actually disenfranchises voters. The American perspective on elections, I think any democracy's perspective on elections, if you have a ruling party that's polling, right, and the exit polls at 40%, 42%, with the Edison poll setting aside the Gorby poll, or polling prior to the elections at 35%, which I think was the last public opinion poll prior to the election, you don't want to disenfranchise those voters. And so for an international community who finds that the party that they prefer to have lost to be declaring a win in an election, they need to examine it with the framework of what did the Georgian people want, and disentangle the majority vote that the Georgian Dream claims from the 42%, which an opposition channel is willing to show in terms of exit polls on their post-election coverage. And what that means is that you want to preserve the real votes, because that is accountability, that is democracy. And because that margin is so thin, it's a 10-point margin, then a forceful international response without clear science behind it, without clear information, is going to be more harmful, I think, in the long term for democracy in Georgia than helpful in the short term. And which leads me to my second point, which is not a foreign policy point, but a domestic observation, which is that I was talking in Georgia this summer to GIP audiences, and I am not surprised by this outcome. This is exactly the outcome that I predicted when talking to GIP audiences this summer, that the Georgian Dream was not a delegitimized party for the majority, for many voters in Georgia, and that Bidzina, without any help from the Russians, the Georgian Dream had enough vested interest in maintaining power that they would be it would be very, very difficult to unseat them electorally. But that takes me off my point. So I think in the short term, the American response, I was taken by Bidzina's point about the need for fact-finding missions and investigation. And I can imagine a scenario where the Americans might not lead that. They may follow an EU effort, but help fund and help provide resources for that kind of investigation. But certainly the Americans are in a waiting pattern. They are responding to what's happening on the ground with the elections, but they're waiting for clear signals of clear falsification that would indicate the extent to which the outcome is different than it would have been without those falsifications. In the medium term, in terms of what would happen after January, and if with a Harris win or with a Trump win, I think in both cases, you're going to find an American electorate and an American system less interested in Georgia than under Biden. I think it's very important to recognize within the American larger political culture, there are fewer cold warriors. And I think the cold warriors, those who have memories of Soviet Russia, are very, very motivated in kind of along, like as known as you point out, the Baltic states and the Scandinavian countries are much more active in taking a firmer role towards Georgian Dream or kind of non-democratic efforts inside of Georgia, non-democratic leadership inside of Georgia. I think for the Americans, with a Trump win, I mean, even Ukraine is in jeopardy. With a Harris win, I don't see the attention coming here when there's so much attention to be given to Ukraine, to be given to Taiwan, and to be given to the Middle East, Gaza, Israel crisis. And so I think then, at least in the middle term, I don't expect a new energy beyond what we currently see from the United States of America. I think you can see a lot of, if with a Harris win, I think you could see a lot of parallel action, the kind of sanctions, the individual sanctions being applied selectively, kind of in what Nona referred to as a carrot stick sort of thing. I don't get the sense, though, that the Americans are eager fully to divest their development money from Georgia and cut off all ties with the current leadership in response to this election. I think there's a lot of waiting to see what the results will hold, and then also what the Georgian people demand. And finally, in the long term, I think there's a lot of commentary in the room about the importance of Georgia, either to the Americans or to Europe or even to Russia. And I wonder actually how true that is. I don't know that Georgia is so important to these places in the world. I think now it's probably really annoying to them. I think that Ukraine is very important. I think Moldova's proximity to Ukraine and its ability to have an election that goes in a less problematic direction for the Europeans will draw attention there. Like this geopolitical chart of who's winning and who's losing and where Georgia is in this win and loss category. I don't see it weighed in very strongly. I mean, as I look at American politics and I look at, kind of the geopolitical conversation, I think the most important Georgia ever was to the United States of America was during the Bush White House and maybe with John McCain and like kind of fleetingly with Biden. And we've seen less attention from Biden than we might have had under a McCain or a kind of neoliberal Bush White House, W. Bush. But I also wonder how important Georgia is to Russia. I mean, Stefan, I mean, it would be interesting to say these sorts of things. I know that Georgia is an important part to avoiding sanctions, but I wonder how much money is really gained through that for the Russians, that they can't run through Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Kyrgyzstan, or somewhere in Central Asia. And so I think then Georgia is part of this broader pantheon of puppets, available puppets, that can be picked up and put down at will. And I think of this in terms of Armenia, right? Like, so you know, if Armenia is important to Russia, why would they abandon Karabakh to the extent that they did? And I mean, you know, Stefan, I'm less of an expert. I can see you shaking your head. So perhaps I'm just being a contrarian here. I don't think Russia's a reliable long-term partner, and I think the Georgians recognize that. And I think the Georgian Dream also recognizes that. Russia is a good short-term partner for this moment, but I think in terms of a long-term partnership, even inside the Georgian Dream, there needs to be a recognition, or there must be a recognition. I presume there's a recognition that how Russia understands Georgia is vastly, vastly different than how the other geopolitical players, Europe and the United States of America, understand Georgia. And I think it's actually a good thing, right, in a way. I mean, Russia, I think, views Georgia as a means to an end, where Europe and the US view Georgia as, you know, less of an expansion of an empire and more of a group that shares philosophies and norms, which is much less materialistic, and I think better for Georgia in the outcome. I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have a number of questions lining up, and also one hand raised. We'll give an opportunity to ask the question live. Before that, allow me to summarize a couple of questions that seem to be touching at the core issue here. So is Georgia truly lost to the West? Because it seems that many of these scenarios that we've been talking about are not that optimistic. It is difficult, it is challenging, number of vulnerabilities, limitations of Western engagement as well. So what should be the way out? What could support democratic forces in Georgia right now? Because what we see is actually very deep polarization in the society. Georgian society is practically split in half. One question reads, which approach could be more useful for the democratic forces, more isolation of the country or so-called normalization, politics of normalization from the West in order to maintain some space? That reminds somewhat the dilemmas around Belarus years ago. Also question from a donor perspective. So is Georgia truly lost? Does it make sense to still keep supporting the country? Maybe it's better to turn attention to Armenia, that seems to be more eager right now to participate in the, engage with the West. Also, we have Murman Margalashvili raising a hand. Can you please, I will ask the host to allow to unmute the microphone so you could ask the question.
No, it's accidentally. I'm just listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. More time for answering the questions. And then there is one question specifically for Nona. Why, in your opinion, Italy has not signed a joint statement of EU ministers on the elections in Georgia? So maybe we could start with you answering the questions, and then I will ask Stefan and Julie.
Okay, starting from the last question, I think there were only 13 countries, EU member states, who signed the letter. I saw there was a comment by Minister of Foreign Affairs Tajani yesterday, a journalist asking him a direct question on the situation unfolding in Georgia, and he clearly said that what we are observing now in Georgia is a Russian attack. And usually we see Russian military attack, but in this case, what we're observing, it's a attempt of influence involving the instruments to influence political electoral processes, not only in Georgia, but in Moldova. And what we are also observing in parallel, these are the cyber attacks conducted by Russia in Europe and in these days actually also in Italy, which brought Tajani to be so open about commenting Russian influence in the electoral processes in Georgia. On the question, kind of the advice to the donors, how to engage the civil society or to switch their attentions from Georgia or to Armenia, independently of Georgia, I would recommend for more attentions to Armenia because they truly deserve it, especially after the end of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which I think is a possibility also to Armenia to go back to troll processes of the EU integration, and I think that they deserve much more support from the international community at the governmental and civil society level. As for the support in Georgian NGOs, I think that the policy of the civil society engagement should be revised. They shall select another organization, more rural-based organization. This top-down approach of engagements has to be changed. It should be bottom-up, and you have to engage those organizations which are not speaking English. To say it, to put it in a simple way. Also, like the thinking about the electoral outcomes in the rural areas and how easy it was for the government to manipulate the elections in rural areas. This makes even more clear that the international community should be focused much more in the rural-based areas rather than the urban-based one. Then maybe other questions I will leave to the other speakers.
Okay, Stefan, please come in.
Yeah, maybe just a quick reaction to Julie. It's always the question in the end, how geopolitical is this and who is important to whom? And I think we tend also to underestimate maybe the domestic drivers sometimes. I still would say, as I already argued, it is important for Russia. It needs these transit routes. It's also for the EU more important now with this connection to Central Asia and Asia, which has become more important. If it's really developing in the size it is discussed, I don't know. But I think for Russia, Iran and the access to Iran is very important. And sure, it can use also the routes via Azerbaijan and the Caspian Sea, which it is also doing, but they are not so well developed, and they also need some kind of investment. So I think from a connectivity perspective, Georgia is a key country in different directions. And connectivity is more important. Also, this Chinese investment in Anaklia deep sea port, China is investing in dots, yeah, and then it will connect these dots on one point. So there is strategic infrastructure, and as the port also to the Black Sea from the South Caucasus, I think it is very important for different kind of countries. And I think additionally for Russia was always the most. It was always the country which was had the biggest progress also in terms of rapprochement with the EU, in terms of reforms, fighting corruption, institutionalization also of this. And I think a failure is definitely so it's definitely important for Russia also. Yeah. So I would still say I think Russia invested quite a lot of in supporting to keep GD in power. But we have to be, and this, I said this also, we have to be careful to say this was operated by Russia. Yeah, so I think Russia is one factor. It's an important factor, also with the war. But I think it is still Ivanishvili who wants to stay in power, who wants to keep options open towards all direction. He wants to benefit from the relations with all sides and use also the location of Georgia to benefit from this. And then it's purely about staying in power and about personal security of one specific person, in my opinion. And that is for me still the main driver, yeah, of his policy. I just maybe on this. If Georgia is lost to the West question, I think for me, maybe let's take it the way around. We have a crisis of the West at the moment. We have a crisis in Europe, internal crisis. We are very much distracted also by our own internal problems and weaknesses. We have the same in the US. You can argue. So I think this is on one hand about attention, but this is also about being a normative power. And being credible also on its normative approach. So the question will be what Europe we will have in the next 5 to 10 years. What is the West at all also as a normative alliance, or yeah, how you want to call it. I think this is also a problem for countries like Georgia, but also for Ukraine or for Moldova. I would never say it's lost forever. I don't think it's possible to make Georgia a Belarus. This society will never accept this. I don't think this is a right pattern to compare or to analyze. So I think we will enter a very difficult period. And I think for me the main challenge is that a lot of people will leave. And I think this is exactly what GD wants, because this is the most active part of the society. And I think this is a threat. This is also what we see in Moldova. The most proactive part of the society is abroad. It's not in the country anymore. And this is for authoritarian governments a very practical thing. You send the money back, and then you have a fragile society which you can manipulate and control. And I think that needs to be prevented. But yeah, very difficult. I think at the moment for me it's very difficult to say, and a lot of will depend on how the society now reacts, how the Western side will in the end react. We just heard about the US. There will be less interest in Georgia and maybe also in the entire South Caucasus. For the EU, the region is important, but it's so much occupied with all these other crises. It's not on the top list of the EU priorities. And the EU is by DNA not a geopolitical actor. It's a bureaucracy. So it's also about the member states and how the member states are taking ownership, are engaging also with Georgia, with the society, with civil society, and with the leadership. And yeah, I can talk about Germany and France, and the big member states are in a leadership crisis. Yeah, so I think we are lacking leadership also on the neighborhood and on the enlargement policy. In a way, it's mainly by the bureaucracy driven, and I think this is the result we have now. Yeah, so and I think this is for me a major problem, that our crisis impacts also on Georgia. And how we operate also, or how we react to this kind of to this election and this rigged election.
Thank you. And Julie, I will ask you then to come in. We can take a couple minutes additional if you need to finish your thought about this resistance to authoritarian trends, and is Georgia truly lost?
I think with respect to the question, I think that nothing is ever truly lost, and Georgia, that every country where there are people fighting to be heard and to be able to hold their governments accountable and to have effective governance that doesn't keep them, as Stefan noticed, absolutely impoverished and a population of vulnerability and poverty, and the use of that vulnerability as a mechanism for people to maintain power, to benefit and profit from government coffers. I think as long as there is a single voice inside the society, then no country is ever lost. And I think that I think it is very, very important that the normative, I really like Stefan's point about it, the normative expression of the West, and I'm a deep believer in Western norms. I'm a small d Democrat, and so I think that these are, I think they're very important to fight for, and I think, as someone who loves Georgia very much, I think it's very important to fight for in Georgia, and as someone who is coming to love Armenia very much, I agree there as well, but also in Azerbaijan and Belarus and anywhere else in this part of the world, especially where it does seem so fraught. I think I just would like to use my last 30 seconds to say something that I think has not been said in a lot of these conversations. And that is, in watching the Georgian Dream, the West, or at least analysts in the West, are understanding politics better in the 2000s under the United National Movement. As somebody who has written a lot about unfair administrative use of resources, this is a very bland term that has come to mean very specific things now, right? Administrative use of resources is telling someone they're going to lose their job unless they don't return votes for a ruling party, right? These are the kinds of registration of falsifications that we see, people's registration cards being stolen or taken from them due to their own economic vulnerability, so that they don't get to vote honestly because their votes are taken from them. And as someone who has been writing this terminology, administrative use of resources, it's something that I've been writing, right, since 2008. And so I think for the West, I think one reticence of the West is that we understand that if the question is Georgia now lost, that means Georgia at one point was won. And when it was won, it was led by people who use these administrative uses of resources in order to win elections. And so I think there are parallel strategies that we can see. And I think this is part of the problem for the coalition of opposition parties. So many were offshoots of UNM. And that's not a language that the West used about UNM in the same way that they use now about the Georgian Dream, but we can see similar behaviors and parallels. And I think that puts the West in a very difficult position to then understand the politics in Georgia. I think that the West now, I think analysts now understand politics in Georgia far, far, far better than we did 15 years ago. But those politics of accountability, which is a small d Democrat kind of thing, is part of what is playing out in the support for the Georgian Dream Party, for better or for worse. And my guess is in many cases it's for worse, because now you have this need to hold an authoritarian, what I agree with Stefan, a fairly authoritarian ruling party to account to it with accountability, without really applying the same kind of accountability to the same kind of parallel forces that we see now. And I think that the Western response is calibrated in part because of that realization. And that calibration means that it cannot act as dogmatically now because of things that happened probably 12, 15 years ago. So that's my thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much for also reminding that the political process is not as much linear as parallel aspects of it are developing together. What we see for the first time is coalitions being formed also in Georgian politics, and opposition winning much more than in previous elections, actually. While polarization in the country is among various lines, democracy versus autocratic pressures and democratic values versus, well, less democratic values, Western versus Russia, war versus peace as the narrative goes. I believe we could continue for another hour or two with this very interesting discussion, but I'd like to thank here all our panelists, also everyone who has joined this virtual discussion. This webinar was part of the REUNIR webinar series. It will be later made available on the online on GAP platforms and REUNIR platforms. We can send the recording to those who would like to see it again. I wish all of you a good evening, and let's stay tuned into what happens in Georgian political developments as well as the world. Thank you.